The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. It's the 11th hour in the standoff between Joe Biden, his donors, the party, and now most recently, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. In a tidal wave of protest, the party's congressional leadership told Biden they'd lost their confidence in him. And those sentiments match a majority of Democratic voters. Meanwhile, Republicans seemed happier than ever as they gathered in Wisconsin just days after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump to pledge their loyalty to the man. It's all amounted to what has to be the weirdest week in American politics. Today on Lever Time, David Sirota and I sit down with Atlantic contributing writer Tyler Austin Harper to unpack how these unfolding political crises seemingly end. Less than a week after surviving an assassination attempt, Donald Trump took the stage at the Republican National Convention.
So to conclude, just a few short days ago, my journey with you nearly ended. We know that. And yet, here we are tonight, all gathered together, talking about the future, promise, and a total renewal of a thing we love very much. It's called America.
The RNC was less of a convention and more of a coronation. For years, the GOP has morphed from a conservative right-wing party to one solely dedicated to supporting Trump. Throughout the week, Republicans of different stripes took to the stage to pay fealty to Trump. Despite the strange week, the convention kind of looked and sounded like your average Republican convention. But this convention was anything but normal. Unlike most political conventions, this one didn't feature scions of the Republican dynasties of the past. There were no cabinet secretaries from previous Republican administrations, and George W. Bush, the last living Republican president, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the head of the Teamsters, one of America's biggest labor unions, took to the stage and railed against corporate power.
And here's another fact. Against gigantic multinational corporation, an individual worker has zero power. It's only when Americans band together in democratic unions that we win real improvements on wages, benefits, and working conditions.
No, this is not your parents' Republican Party. Instead, the week was filled with Trump's allies and the next generation of Republicans, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and J.D. Vance, who was announced as Trump's vice presidential pick this week.
We will protect the wages of American workers and stop the Chinese Communist Party from building their middle class on the backs of American citizens.
Vance, perhaps more than the others, seemed to represent what feels like a realignment in Republican politics. In the Senate, he surprisingly reached across the aisle on some populist measures. He teamed up with Elizabeth Warren to try to penalize bankers whose banks failed. He's praised Lina Khan, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, for going after gigantic firms like Amazon and Google. He even supported cracking down on the credit card industry.
We need a leader who's not in the pocket of big business, but answers to the working man, union and non-union alike.
None of this feels like the party of Ronald Reagan, the man who ushered in the era of mega corporations and monopolies. Then again, in politics, chameleons are a dime a dozen, and Vance is a perfect example of that. 8 years ago, Vance once compared Trump to Hitler. A few years later, he defended Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election on baseless lies. Then this week, he stood next to the former president, smiling like a kid holding an ice cream cone. And while his Senate record has earned him the reputation of being something of an economic populist, let's remember Vance as a multi-millionaire venture capitalist. Someone who spent years in Silicon Valley learning how to make money, which is why it's notable that several tech VCs, the big money investors, seemed elated by Vance's elevation. As one venture capitalist put it, we've now got one of our own going to the White House. Perhaps most revelatory, though, was Vance's recent comments to lobbyists where he walked back his support for reining in credit card fees. And that goes for Trump, too. Let's not forget that despite Donald Trump claiming to be a crusader for the working class, the things he brags about the most are cutting taxes and regulations. Whatever is going on, though, something has changed. While it remains to be seen whether Republicans are really evolving, it is clear this is a different party from the past. The old guard's defeated, and a new generation of conservatives are here. Rather than pledge fealty to corporate America and big business, these Republicans are culture warriors. Ones who don't mind trying to punish big business for pushing back on their conservative and frequently narrow view of what it means to be an American.
Now, it is part of that tradition, of course, that we welcome newcomers. But when we allow newcomers into our American family, we allow them on our terms.
Meanwhile, the Democrats are collapsing. This week, new reporting said that Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, the congressional leaders for the Democrats, both think that Biden should drop out. Even more damning is that Nancy Pelosi does too. Then add to that a COVID-19 diagnosis that for President Biden has once again put the precarity of his age back into the spotlight. The situation has become so bad that some senior Democrats speculate Biden could drop out of the race as soon as this weekend. To make sense of all of this, I turned to Tyler Austin Harper. Tyler's a frequent contributor to The Atlantic and an assistant professor of environmental studies at Bates College in Maine. David Sirota and I sat down with Tyler to see if he could help make sense of one of the strangest weeks in American politics, if not American history.
Tyler, awesome to have you here. Welcome to Lever Time. I think where I'd love to start just with this conversation is let's go back to a little less than a week ago. To place it, I was in a pizza place with my friends and all of a sudden they start pointing at the TV and you see the Trump rally. He grabs his ear. Later on, we find out this was an assassination attempt. But I think what's more remembered is the iconic image by that AP photographer of Trump raising his fist. He's, blood's clearly on his face. What was your first impression of that image, Tyler? And if history or politics is a narrative, if you will, what does it seem like the narrative now? I feel like there's post-picture an assassination attempt of Trump America, and there might even be like the pre-assassination attempt on Trump America. And the narrative feels like it may have shifted, but we're so early in this. But for someone who I know thinks a lot about this kind of stuff, what was your impression? And do you see a narrative shift that's now happened in kind of the American discourse?
I see a slight narrative shift. It's not as big as I would have thought. When I first saw that photo, first of all, I will say I was relieved that, the former president survived,
right.
Regardless of how I feel about him, political violence is bad.
Mm-hmm.
But upon seeing that photo and watching video of him, pumping his fist and his face is covered in blood and he's yelling fight, immediately my heart dropped a little bit because I was like, that is going to be a really, iconic photo that I think is really going to rally a lot of his supporters. And, it is this moment where I think a lot of us on the left tend to, very reasonably so, make fun of, the Trump fans who do all the fan art and the, imagine Trump as a Revolutionary War hero with a six-pack and a bare chest and stuff. And, we should make fun of that stuff. But this was a kind of moment where how Trump fans imagine Trump kind of collided with reality for a minute, because he did have this, I think, surprising to many of us moment of kind of, bravery and stoicism. But that being said, I think the image hasn't had, at least to my mind, as much impact as I initially suspected. I think for a number of reasons. One is that the shooter is a Republican, and that has kind of muddled and quieted the narrative a little bit. And so I'm not sure if the assassination is going to be as big of a factor as I maybe originally anticipated. I mean, that could change. It's only been a week, but so far, it seems like we moved on a little quicker than I anticipated.
Yeah, I think what was interesting about the revelation of the identity of the shooter is that it wasn't coming across so much as a political assassination, but it was emblematic of another very unfortunate aspect of American life, which is the mass shootings. And shootings are very normal. Even if you're the president of the United States, it can happen at your events. Another thing I think about is for the left and the right, or however we want to kind of break things down, America's clearly really polarized. And I feel like if you were MAGA or if you were on the conservative side, you saw one thing in that image. You saw defiance. You saw perseverance in the face of perceived attempts to stop you or take you down or threats against you. And I think if you're on the liberal side, if you were someone who's very concerned about the state of the election and you're like a political guy, you probably said, oh my God, this could be the election. But I think that another aspect is, it was a frightening idea that this is now coming home to America. Where do you think that those two camps are? Like, how do you think that picture can be interpreted? And have you seen kind of different interpretations of that picture in the past week?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Republicans are rallying around it. It's, as anyone would have guessed, it's being put on T-shirts and flags and signs and those kinds of things.
By the way, did you see that the AP put out a directive saying nobody is allowed to reprint the picture without their express written consent? I feel like the AP.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the AP sort of said hey, this is our picture. So I feel like there's going to be a battle of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. People selling bootleg T-shirts outside of Trump rallies. And,
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah. No, I did not see that. That's interesting. I do think the Republicans are rallying around the image. I do think the one thing I think is positive about it is, like I said, I do think it allowed a certain kind of person on the left like me to see Trump through the eyes of his supporters, which is I think humanizing in a way. Someone asked me if I felt the same, because when I saw that photo, I was like, that is, in fact, a pretty cool photo. And someone asked me if I felt that way about the mugshot, which was also a kind of rallying image for Trump voters. And I was like, no, because that just confirmed my preconceived notions of him as a felon, So no. But this was an image where I think myself and a number of other people on the left kind of saw it and were like, I get what the appeal is for his voters. And yes, there's this delusional aspect to imagining Trump as this crusading hero. But there is you can understand the appeal, at least in a kind of this frozen moment, But it does not seem like it's going to have any lasting purchase. I also think there's just a problem, which is that both of these candidates their support feels really locked in at this point. Both of them seem to be they seem to have a floor and a ceiling that is a pretty narrow bandwidth, and they're just fluctuating within that. And I'm not sure that there's this legion of swing state voters that, maybe if the election were being held next week, that he'd have a big bump, but I don't know that image 4 months from now is going to be what, drags him across the finish line.
I think what was
amazing
it's
a bunch of other things
about
that will.
The image and the video actually is how media literate Donald Trump is. I perceived it as this guy has conflict and spectacle and message so baked in to the reptilian part of his brain that even amid the chaos and scariness of that moment, you could almost see it something kicked in. There's this moment where the Secret Service are on top of him, and then he's like, "Wait a minute!" You could see it, the gears were turning. He was
if you did you hear the actual audio? Is when he gets back up, there is audio of it, and he says, "Wait."
Yes.
Then he says, "Let me get my shoe," and then he says, "Wait," and he says, "Fight." And I think you're completely right. I think there was an aspect of Trump because Trump is a media creation. His whole rise is the media, and I don't think it's conspiratorial at all to think that in that moment. He said, this is an opportunity, and I got to send a message. So wait, don't escort me off right away.
And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I want to give him credit in this way, which is I think that is the instinct that a political leader, frankly, needs to have. That I was impressed. I don't like Donald Trump. That's an understatement, right? But I was impressed that even amid that chaos, he was essentially, I have to present not just as a leader, but I am going to present even further as as sort of an image of leadership. I'm going to use this moment to egg on my movement, and I don't think there's. It's opportunistic. it's super media literate, and I think in some weird way it's almost admirable. It's like, I mean, I don't want to go so far as I saw somebody online say, oh well, this is the proof of Donald Trump is the man in the arena. He's Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, I don't want to go
I saw that.
all the way to that. But I do think it's like, this is why Donald Trump is a formidable force in American politics, because he has that instinct.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, I also think, too, there's just like a thing that's really frustrated me with the Biden supporters is that when he looks frail and can't project anything approaching vitality, they're like, well, the president's job isn't to project, youthful vigor, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, I mean, it is a little bit.
No, I would
actually.
say I'd
they're
actually
supposed
say it's
to project.
The job. I think that's most of the job, actually. And we'll get it. I mean, okay, we can talk about it right now. My view is that this whole idea that like there's this presidency job that you do over here, you're like, doing policy and you're sitting in the Oval Office. And then there's this like other job that's like a side job where you're like communicating and being like a public leader. I think that's horseshit. I think it's like,
totally. No, absolutely.
10% of your job is like real-time spot decisions, right? 10% of your job is like appointing the people to make the thousands of decisions that you can't make every day. And then like 80% of your job is the public stuff. That's like 80% of the job.
Totally.
And if you can't do that job effectively, then you're saying you really can't do the whole job, right? There's no just doing the 20%
100%.
and not doing the 80%. When you wake up in the morning and see the recent headlines about the Supreme Court,
a judicial decision sparking a political eruption,
I'm guessing you feel overwhelmed and bewildered.
The Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade.
Well, it's terrifying. I don't know what's next.
You hear about the court helping corporations trample your long-standing rights.
This is a sweeping decision by the Supreme Court to overturn the Chevron precedent.
What this does is it ends 40 years of regulating big business.
You hear about the justices making it literally legal to bribe politicians.
In a 6-3 opinion, the court ruled that gifts to public officials can only be considered illegal bribes if they're given before the official act.
It seems like every few months the Supreme Court makes it easier and easier to bribe government officials.
You even hear about the Supreme Court actually declaring that the president does not have to follow the law.
It's the first time the Supreme Court has ruled that former presidents can be shielded from criminal charges.
In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law.
As you're doom scrolling, do you ever stop and ask, what the actual is going on? And how in God's name did we get here? Well, we have an answer for you. It wasn't a random coincidence, and it wasn't just by chance. What's happening right now is the culmination of a very deliberate and very secret scheme, executed by specific people with specific goals. I'm David Sirota. As a longtime journalist and author, I've spent decades working in and covering American politics. Our team of reporters at The Lever is about to expose the never-before-reported details of this plot in our upcoming new investigative podcast series, Master Plan.
They are actually trying to open our political world to right-wing dark money.
Something very weird is going on.
That doesn't fly. It's got to be money.
Where's all this money coming from?
We've spent 2 years reporting this story, so you're not going to want to miss it. Go to masterplanpod.com to sign up to be the first to get the series when it launches in August. You can also find the trailer and subscribe to the podcast feed right now by searching Master Plan in your podcast app.
Well, we talk about, growing up, you're supposed to take writing classes, you're supposed to take public speaking classes. I mean, we all work in a communicative, I was going to call it an art, but I don't know if what we do is an art, David, but we work in a communications field. But it's like the whole kind of double think with what Biden is doing is now it's like, no, communicating your ideas isn't important. Being able to communicate at all isn't important. Just being smart. And I think to myself, there is no job that you can realistically do where you can just say like, I don't have to communicate at all. I'm sure there are some, but like, I worked in the hospitality sector. That's all communication. Journalism is all communication. One quick thing I do want to just double back on, though, is something that, Tyler, you were saying earlier, which is that the assassination attempt doesn't really seem to have moved where people are. And, I feel like that's notable, and not to, call you out on this, David, but you were somewhere present in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was also, he had an assassination attempt.
I was 6, so I have no memory.
Yeah.
I'm old. I'm not like that old.
Well, I was just wondering that, was that a moment, though, where I think a lot of people saw the head of state suffer an assassination attempt, and it galvanized people. I mean, it was a national conversation. I think even if you were a Democrat or a liberal, you felt moved in a way because it was this idea that there was a wholeness, that the presidency was whole. This, seeing the way that we're kind of able to move past it, feels like it underscores the factionalization or just the fracturing of America, whether it's through media discourse, through politics, or everything. Tyler, I'd be curious what you think of that, and then David too.
Yeah, I do think I will say the response across the board has been more moderate than I expected. And I do think, I think the reaction of a lot of everyday people is, I think this is sort of getting, I don't want to say it's getting memory hold, but I do think there was a sense that a lot of people had that this was a moment where if this bullet were an inch to the right, we'd be in a very different country. Particularly, I mean, given the massive Secret Service just incompetence, the conspiracy theories we're already seeing, I mean, those would be cranked up to 11, And so I do think a lot of people saw that we were at this moment, we were kind of on the edge of a cliff. And I think without giving anyone too much credit, I do think there was a little bit of backing away from the edge, both with politicians and with the public. I think that's partly because, again, the shooter was a Republican. I think if this were, some supercharged Democrat that had been mainlining cable news and fascism rhetoric and then try to shoot Trump, I think we'd be having a different conversation. But I guess the glass half empty way to read it is as this like fracturing, and we didn't have this kumbaya moment. But I think the glass half empty way to read it is that I think a lot of people were like, this could go down a very dark path if we really leaned into it. And I think a lot of people stepped back a little bit. And who knows if that lasts, if, Trump starts slipping in the polls, maybe there'll be a strategy of, they tried to kill me, they were out to get me, et cetera, et cetera. So, I'm not trying to give too much credit in advance, but I do think there's like a glass half empty case to be made for how quickly we move past this.
I think it's coming back. I think it may go dormant for a little bit, and I think Trump was clearly shaken by it, understandably so. But I think it's going to come back. I don't think it's just sort of like a blip. And to be clear, there have been assassination attempts that really were blips. I mean, I think Gerald Ford faced 2 assassination attempts in the course of like 4 or 5 weeks. I may be getting some of this wrong, but yeah, there were. I think he had 2 assassination attempts, and they were kind of blips. He wasn't shot, by the way. I mean, Trump literally had blood on his face, which illustrates how close it got, right? But I do think that I do think what was so terrifying about it, and I was so happy that Trump was not actually assassinated, is because I think you're right. That would have taken this situation, obviously, to a potentially even darker place. I mean, clearly we are. Lots of people feel like we are on the precipice of something. Like this all feels like a breaking point. And the thing is that it's funny. I had a long planned trip with my wife last week. It was like planned it forever ago. It was like, we're doing this trip. And literally when I called back into work, just to check in, I'm like, this feels like the biggest news week of a generation. I mean, it really feels like Joe Biden, the current president, is teetering. The opponent was just faced an assassination attempt. I mean, this really feels, in some ways, like it must have felt. I imagine it must have felt back in the 60s and early 70s. And you look back on it in history and you're like, wow, it must have been interesting to live through that. Now you're actually living through it and you're like, wow, this actually doesn't feel that sweet. Like this doesn't, interesting is not the right yeah, right. Yeah. I mean
use the soundtrack
right.
as worse.
I mean, I think so I guess, Tyler, I would throw it back to you and ask, how much do you think, I mean, let's talk about the Trump existential threat thing, the response that Trump and Trump's side did throw out, which was that, you know, you saw J.D. Vance, for instance, was the first one out there to try to kind of blame the other side for this. And you saw other Republican Congress people saying, oh, you know, I saw one say, this was ordered by Joe Biden, or, you know, this is because the other side has been calling Trump a fascist or a threat to democracy. And then, of course, predictably, you saw the Democrats immediately fold and start essentially insinuating a set of apologies. I mean, I guess the question that comes out of that is, you know, how much do you think the Democrats are going to basically stand down at least a little bit because of what happened? How much do you think Trump being able to portray himself as a victim will essentially bully the Democrats into a softer posture against him?
I think the Democrats always have been, and lately absolutely have been, looking for any excuse to be incompetent cowards. And so I think the Trump thing is just the latest excuse, the assassination attempt to, you know, stay this disastrous course that we're on with Biden, you know. And so I don't think it's that they're misreading the situation or like, oh, I think we need to, you know, moderate our tone and talk a little bit less about the fascism thing, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that comes from a sincere place. I think, you know, they're just hell-bent on this course of action. Everyone is paralyzed with fear that they're going to be held accountable for any decision that gets made. So instead, they're making no decision at all. And so I just think the assassination thing is a convenient excuse to do nothing, which they've already been doing, you know, and now they have some minor justification.
I mean, what do we make of this thing? Of this tension here where, and it's kind of an unanswerable question, but this tension where the Democrats are constantly saying Donald Trump represents an existential threat to the country, an existential threat to democracy, an existential threat to sort of the quote unquote normal way of American life. And yet the Democrats seem not to be in action taking those same threats and warnings seriously in putting up much of a fight against Donald Trump. I mean, what is the takeaway from that? That the politicians just don't believe he's that much of a threat? Like they're just saying it, but they don't believe it. I mean, I've kind of said that having worked in politics, having worked in journalism for as long as I have, my suspicion is that the Democrats don't believe their own rhetoric about Donald Trump, or at least the people speaking just think, hey, yeah, Donald Trump represents a threat, but I'll be fine, so we don't really have to take it that seriously. But I do wonder if you think that's the case. Is there some other explanation for how they could be sounding the alarm about Trump with the tenor of the rhetoric that they use, but then not in actions seeming to be willing to run any kind of serious opposition campaign to Trump right now? What's your takeaway on that?
Yeah, no, I don't think they believe it at all. I mean, I'm sure some of them individually do, but I think collectively they absolutely do not. I mean, one of the reasons, you know, people are like, well, Biden's so weak. Why has no one come forward and say, I will run against Biden if he was, or I will be the nominee if he withdraws from the race, or I'd like to throw my hat in the ring? And the answer to that is very simple, which is that a number of these Democrats like Gavin Newsom, et cetera, are waiting for 2028 to have their election bid, right? And you know, so that gives the lie a bit to this idea that, oh, if we have Trump, there's going to be no more elections, when all these Democrats are just like quietly sitting back, waiting for 2028, the next election. So like, no, I don't think they believe this at all. You know, I mean, there's been reporting from Ezra Klein and other people that behind the scenes, they're like, well, you know, if Trump wins, he wins, and like, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't think they believe it at all. I think there's a percentage of like shut-ins and people who watch a lot of cable news that, you know, what gets called blue MAGA that really absolutely believe the fascism stuff. I don't think most Democratic officials believe it. I don't think most voters believe it. I don't think minority voters who apparently, according to the Democrats, are going to get sent to the camps if Trump is elected believe that, because they're breaking black voters are breaking 20 to 25% for Trump. Hispanics are breaking about 50% for Trump. And so this whole narrative of like fascism, democracy's over, no more elections, we're going to have a racist Handmaid's Tale hellscape. No one believes that, and that's why we're losing, because that has been the message of the Democratic Party, not a policy platform, not this is what we stand for, this is our economic agenda, this is how we're going to rebuild the middle class. It has been, if you don't vote for us, it's basically a hostage situation. You're going to get this racist fascist, and no one believes it. And, this is the problem with putting forward Joe Biden, right? Like, if nobody believes the lie you're trying, like, you shouldn't lie, but if no one believes the lie you're trying to tell, that A, there's going to be fascism, and B, this man is competent to serve another 4 years, then obviously people are just going to ignore you. And that's what we're seeing happening.
I want to pipe up and say
it's
that
nihilism across the board.
I think there's a grain of truth in there. In the idea that Donald Trump, and I mean this sort of the term specifically, has fascist or authoritarian tendencies. Now, I don't think that means he's Hitler, right? Like, Bolsonaro was a fascist, right? Like, Erdogan in Turkey is a fascist. Modi is a fascist, right? Like,
or the guy
Orban is a fascist. And in each of those different societies, some modicum of democracy exists. I mean, it's worse in Hungary than it is in some of the other examples that, but the point is that I don't think it's like the election is like Trump gets elected, that's it, we're now the Third Reich, right? I mean, that's like obviously absurd. And I think the Democrats sometimes sound like that. And I think a lot of people then tune it out and eye roll it. But
I mean, the New Republic is printing magazine covers with Trump in the image of Hitler. It's insane.
That is absolutely insane. Now, and it violates Godwin's law, right? Godwin's law is the law of online discourse, that every argument ends up with somebody ultimately making a Hitler reference. And that essentially when you make a Hitler reference, like, your argument's over, like nobody can hear anything. I actually, so I'm going to break Godwin's law myself right here and say that I do think there are like echoes of what happened between Weimar Germany and the Third Reich, that transition. There are echoes in the United States about our politics. I don't think that means that Donald Trump is Hitler or that the Nazis are coming into power. So I think in some ways what we're really saying is the Democrats have like overplayed their hand on that that argument. And now they've numbed everyone to the real, actual less than Hitler dangers of Donald Trump. Like, for instance, this week at The Lever, we reported that J.D. Vance went on record to try to pressure federal regulators to allow local police to access women's private medical records for the purposes of following them into other states when they seek abortion services in other states. Now, that's pretty fascist, right? That's and it's real. Like, that's a real thing that really happened. What I fear, honestly, is that in the context of this election, because Democrats have so overplayed their hands, that there's a portion of the population that could be a swingable vote that can't hear that because they're like, that's bullshit. Like, you're just telling me Trump's Hitler more now. So I don't even believe, like, they won't even believe the real stuff because they've heard too much Trump is Hitler and they know Trump isn't Hitler.
Yes, I think that's the real danger here, is that there is almost no chance that Trump is Hitler and we have some American Reich. There's a very good chance we have Democratic backsliding, which is the way to think about things, I think. And there's a really good chance that we have an expansion of the role that the National Guard plays in our everyday life because of immigration stuff, etc. All of which is really bad. And I think the danger is not simply by overplaying your hand. I think it's bad electorally, but I also think It's also bad because it normalizes, if we have anything that falls short of an American Reich, it basically becomes, well, actually, it wasn't that bad, right? Like, oh, we're like merely tracking pregnant women. You all said we're going to have this dystopian Handmaid's Tale hellscape. I can still go to the grocery store and hang out with my friends, and we have a normal society, but some things are worse, right? And I think that's the real danger.
He was only an American Mussolini. He wasn't an American Hitler, so it's cool.
Exactly. Yes. And I think that's actually really dangerous because it kind of, I think, desensitizes us to like some really bad things that could happen in the next 4 years, you know?
Yeah. And I think what you're getting at is something I've been thinking a lot about, which is, you know, we've talked a lot about the right and conservatives. And to be very clear, I think the far right uses some of the most insane, hyperbolic language, you know, saying radical socialists are going to take over the country and Biden's the second coming of Stalin. That's ridiculous too. But now I do see just such a detachment from the Democrats in almost a sillier way is the way that now, because they realize they have such a bad candidate in Joe Biden, it's like polls are fake, all the reporting about him is fake, all the concerns are fake. Yeah, you guys are all
liking Kamala as racist.
Yeah, you guys are just making everything up. That feels a little Trumpian, but something that I do wonder is that the state of politics has become not just corrosive to the point that most people, I would say probably sane people, look at that and say, hell no, I don't ever want to participate in that arena. But I also just feel like politics has gotten so detached from most people. Like, I go on Twitter and I'm like, to really be the man in the arena on Twitter, you have to have such a pessimistic, angry outlook sometimes on the world. You have to constantly think the world is teetering on the brink of whole destruction. And when I live in Washington, D.C. When I get out of D.C., when I stop talking to people in the political class, I realize people are concerned. They don't want abortions to be tracked like that. They don't want this encroachment of their civil rights. They're also living their lives. You know, they're still able to be happy. They can still hang out with their friends. You know, they can still record stupid TikToks at the office of everyone dancing around. And that to me is this disconnect where our political elite from both parties have felt that they can just message this fatalistic, angry thing. And I think a lot of the country is like, it's not that bad. Like, can we still enjoy our lives? And I don't know where that's coming from, but it doesn't seem like it is a winning electoral strategy, especially for the Democrats. But I'd be curious what you guys think.
No, I agree with you. You know, right after Trump was, you know, shot, I went to pick up pizza because I was writing an article in response to it, and I wasn't going to make dinner, so I went to pick up pizza at this bar nearby that does pizza, and it's kind of a Trumpy-ish place with what I will describe as a very purple clientele. I live in Maine, and I went into this bar, and it's kind of a sports bar, so there's TVs everywhere, etc. Not a single TV had CNN or Fox News or like the news on, and it was like 2 hours after the shooting, so clearly people knew that this had happened, and they were just hanging out and drinking and eating pizza and like talking about sports, and I really do think like the average, and this is, not to circle back, but one of the reasons why I think the Trump assassination thing is probably just a wash, because I think there's a certain kind of swing voter, maybe, who's like, you know what, he was tough and resolute and Biden's this frail old man, I'm going to vote for Trump. Sure, I believe some of those people exist. I also think there are people, and it's not Trump's fault someone tried to shoot at him, but I think there is also people that are like, he invites chaos. I don't want 4 more years of this. Like, I want to be normal and just like live my life and not have to watch the news constantly because our country's insane, And yeah, I don't know. I do think it is the political class that views this election, because, and I think it's worth saying, right? I mean, you pointed this out, but the Republicans equally cast this election in existential terms. They did that in 2016 with the Flight 93 election discourse. We absolutely see that now. Trump saying, you won't have a country if you don't vote for me. So both sides do it. But I just don't think regular people really believe that. I was struck by a lot of the interviews with people coming out of the Trump rally with BBC and, all these news outlets. And almost every Trump supporter they talked to was like, there's a lot of anger in this country and people on both sides are really mad. And it just feels like we should all be able to have our political opinions, blah, blah, blah. And it was not like it was not a call for like violence and bloodshed. It was like, it seems like things are getting out of hand. And so I think the narrative that this election's existential is something that only politicos and like really hardcore supporters on either side believe.
I also think that you may be right that the assassination itself will end up being on a voting level a political wash in this way. I do think there's something to the idea that as many people who will be motivated to support Trump because he looked like a strong, resolute figure in that moment, and that moment kind of crystallized that image for him in contrast to the weak, frail, old Joe Biden. As many voters who are going to be motivated by that, you're right. There may be as many voters who are like, Trump is a circus, Trump is a chaos agent, he brings chaos wherever he goes, not blaming him for being shot at, but that I just don't want that. Like, I was going to vote against all of that. And so electorally, it may be a wash. Where I think Trump has a potential advantage in this race is in how he imagistically, and I want to make that distinct from policy, imagistically is trying to reshape what the Republican Party exudes. And I think his pick of J.D. Vance executed that rather perfectly. And I actually think that his pick of J.D. Vance was a good political pick, a shrewd move. Again, just for anyone who takes me out of context, I'm not saying I like J.D. Vance. I'm saying I think as a political move, I think it was smart in that he is trying to reshape the Republican Party to have and I'm putting this in quotes, a populist image. I think the Democrats have given up trying to look like a populist party, or at least for now have given up trying to look like a populist party. They are trying to be a party that defends norms and institutions and normalcy. And Trump and the Republicans want to exude it's not just grievance, right? I mean, the old conservative politics of pure grievance, it's not just like Rush Limbaugh grievance. It's like it's a forward-thinking populism. And J.D. Vance, who has worked with Democrats on various populist bills in Congress, to lower the price of insulin, rail safety legislation, et cetera, et cetera. J.D. Vance talks a good game about being a different kind of Republican. And I think that is, I can see the appeal of that, right? I can, and I, with all the criticism of the agenda, knowing that they're putting forward a populist image, while also, putting forward an agenda that's basically the Mitt Romney agenda, the George Bush agenda, right? I mean, that's the funny thing is that like the country club Republicans are sort of out of the leaders are kind of out. They're not at the convention. They're out of the Republican Party, but like their agenda is still there. I mean, Trump is talking this week about cutting corporate tax rates. So like, how populist are we talking? But this is my take is, and tell me if you guys think I'm wrong. My take is that if you acknowledge that we live in a country where elections have become all about vibes, and I think that's unfortunate, then the policy agenda actually, whether it's populist or not, matters less than whether you look like a populist. Don't you agree?
Oh, I think that's absolutely the case with J.D. Vance. And I want to get this to you, Tyler, and hear what you think, because to me, J.D. Vance has been so funny if you take the idea that, and David and I were talking about this before we logged on, that politicians are not vehicles to have constituents get policy pushed across or do what's best. They're not superheroes. They're not celebrities. They're just that. But we don't live in that place. We see politicians as storylines and narratives and characters. So J.D. Vance has always struck me as funny because I remember when that Hillbilly Elegy came out and it was like, oh, this is perfect. We've got the Cassandra who's telling us what's going on in rural white America. And all of these liberals flocked to him as basically, translate the mysterious, angry world. And now he, runs for Senate. He flips politically and everyone's really pissed off and angry. But there's a part of me that's like, okay, but this is a liberal problem that you wanted a storyline about rural white America. And I don't know J.D. Vance. I've never spoken to J.D. Vance. He might just be a political chameleon. But on one hand, people are sort of picking apart, particularly on the liberal side, like, oh, well, if he's such a rural white American, how come he went to Yale? How come he works in venture capital? And a part of me is like, I mean, does that mean you're still not from a rural area? You're still not a white American? Like, well, what do these kind of weird factors have to do with your identity? But you wrote a really cool article in The Atlantic about another book called, I believe, White Rural Rage. Tell me about this book. I admittedly did not read it. Your piece made a good case of from an anthropological sense of why. But this idea of just like parachuting in and trying to conjure up storylines out of people's lives, what were you talking about with White Rural Rage? And do you see some of that with kind of Vance right now, this obsession with rural America?
Yeah, I think what that book did was play into a lot of stereotypes about rural America that I just don't think are true. And that really downplayed, that wasn't very interested in asking. I'm perfectly willing to admit rural America has more problems with racism than other parts of the country and that they're more conservative, et cetera. That's obviously true. But there was just a deep curiosity in that book about how that became the case and what are the structural factors and forces that lead to this broad and sweeping discontent in these kinds of places and economic commiseration and so on, And I do think that there is this kind of, noble savage trope that gets applied to rural people that liberals just like love to mine them for their, folksy wisdom and get emissaries from the white working class to tell it like it is, and J.D. Vance plays into that. But I do want to pick up on something you said, David, which is that I agree. I've been shocked that my fellow liberals think, one, that J.D. Vance was a bad pick, and two, think he was the worst available pick for our country. I mean, and I think there's a way in which they kind of tell on themselves that the Democratic Party actually is just a party in the service of Wall Street elites and wealthy suburbanites, right? Because if you're thinking about J.D. Vance, and I don't want to give him too much credit, I don't believe all the shtick, but he has done some bipartisan economically populist things with Democrats. And so he's the most moderate economically of the available Republican vice presidential candidates. And then you're all melting down about picking that choice. It's like, well, if you're going to pick one of them, I think I'd probably prefer the economic populist. I'm not going to like any of their policies, and I think they'll be just a smokescreen for Mitt Romneyism. But nonetheless, I found it really baffling that, so many ostensible leftists seem to prefer like a Mitt Romney clone in the vice presidency than J.D. Vance. But secondly, I think you're right. I think it's vibes and aesthetics. One thing I'm really interested in, in grad school, I did a lot of sort of research and work on the history of the American right. And it's something a lot of people don't realize is that before the really Cold War 1940s, 1950s, there was a deep strain of free market skeptical, vaguely anti-capitalist conservatism that ran through America. And I think what we're seeing with J.D. Vance and the Trump-Vance ticket is a resurrection of the aesthetics of that. I don't think the substance of it's being resurrected, but the aesthetics of we are anti-free market. We're a little agnostic about capitalism. We're certainly very agnostic about global capitalism. And we're going to talk this big economic game. And I don't think it's completely a lie. I think there's been a lot of discourse about J.D. Vance as a fraud, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure there's something to that. But he also does have a record of accomplishing some economically populist things, as you mentioned, David, And so I think you can overstate how much of an economic populist he is. But I also think there's a lot of understating it that's happening right now, But I do think we're seeing the aesthetics of this anti-free market old conservatism returning. How much of the substance will get's an open question, but I think that is the vibe, and I think that's a winning vibe because the Democrats are not. I mean, they've abandoned economic populism. I'm not even sure what their platform is at this point.
The crazy thing about the Democrats abandoning economic populism is that in policy, they actually haven't. That's the craziest part of this whole election. I've said it before. Absolutely. I will say it again. Joe Biden. We're not talking about the aesthetic of Joe Biden. We're just talking about the actual policies. Joe Biden has put forward and enacted the most populist economic policy agenda of any president in 50 years. Now, I always caveat 100%. That by saying that's also a big commentary on the past presidents of the last 50 years. Okay, yeah. It's a low bar, but in presentation and in brand, you wouldn't know that, because the brand that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party puts forward is a brand of managing a decline, defending defending manners, etiquette, norms, right? They are not in a posture, a fighting spirit posture, whereas the Republicans are. And typically in elections, the public is voting for the fighting posture, the happy warrior, right? That's typically and I think the Republicans get that. And the Democrats, that's the craziest part. They're actually enacting a moderately populist agenda, and they're not branding themselves as popular, or they're unable to, or they're right. I mean, that's the craziest part of this. Now, I want to go back to Vance and this aesthetic change of the Republican Party. I totally agree with you. And I was terrified, frankly, when Donald Trump first got elected president. My theory was, okay, if this guy's smart, here's what he's going to do. Okay, he's going to go out there, and the first thing he's going to do is do something like, if folks remember this at the time, there was that stalled tunnel between New Jersey and New York, right? New York and New Jersey, they need to build this Amtrak tunnel, and it's been stalled in bureaucratic red tape and environmental review, and it hasn't been built, right? And I was like, you know what's going to happen is that the first thing Donald Trump is going to do is he's going to be like, I'm going to build that tunnel in like 6 months, and I'm not going to give a shit about the environmentals. I'm going to show that like I'm a big government Republican. Just get it done. I don't care about, I'm not going to worry about my party and talking about spending. I'm going to like rebrand as this like big government Republican populist, right? And I was afraid he was going to do that. And he didn't do that because he got, and I've heard people theorize that it's because Bannon got out of the White House. Bannon wasn't there. Bannon was the kind of guy, the smart kind of guy who would have told him to do that. And instead he got surrounded by Gary Cohn from Goldman Sachs, et cetera, and essentially governed like Mitt Romney. And that was his mistake. But I think this time around, my guess is that Trump gets it. And that the pick of Vance, I think Vance gets it too. And I think the scary story to tell about J.D. Vance is not that he's, the corporate class is necessarily their worst, their biggest hero, right? I think the scary story to tell about Vance, on top of the abortion stuff, is that J.D. Vance is like the guy from House of Cards. J.D. Vance doesn't seem to have lots of principles really at all, and is sort of a political killer in that way. And like if he gets on the Trump track, I fear that J.D. Vance has the capability of doing like really evil things for his own ascension, regardless of what he said like 5 minutes ago, right? Now, here's the question that I have when people look at this Republican realignment. There's two schools of thought. The tension with right-wing populism is always this. How much cultural extremism are you willing to swallow with your economic populism, right? Like is the cultural extremism, the J.D. Vance empowering the police to go after women who are seeking abortion services, is the cultural extremism sort of the sugar that makes the economic populism go down the throat of the Republican Party? Or is it the other way around, right? Is the real thing the cultural agenda, right? The cultural extremism, and the economic populism is for the so-called useful idiots on the left to say, hey, J.D. Vance isn't so bad. It's the old idea, well, Hitler was a vegetarian, right? Like, yeah. Right? Like, which is it? Because I think that there are people who fear that saying anything complimentary or not oppositional to J.D. Vance worked with Democrats on this or that even saying that means you're accepting the whole agenda of you're helping him with the really evil stuff he wants to do. Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I think if Trump Vance are elected to the White House, that Democrats have a responsibility to the American public to work across the aisle on these areas of economic compromise and try to make the world a little bit better for people, whether or not there's like a horribly regressive agenda that they aren't going to support happening, in another part of the administration. But I think the question is, how intelligent are Trump, Vance, and how politically savvy are they? Because this is not, I don't feel like people are talking about this enough. I've been yelling about it on Twitter for a while. The Republican Party is wielding a multiracial coalition in this election. As I mentioned earlier, they're getting a quarter of Black Americans. They're getting half of Hispanics, right? J.D. Vance's wife is an Indian woman. So this idea that this is, is there racist rhetoric coming from the Republican side? Absolutely. Do racists vote for Republicans? Absolutely. But it's also the case that there are many minorities in this country are a hell of a lot more culturally conservative than progressives admit. They bury their heads in the sand. Black Americans, 25% of Black Americans identify as conservative. I think another 50% identify as moderates. Only like 4% of Black Americans at the height of Black Lives Matter supported defunding the police. So this is a pretty conservative group of people. Same thing with Hispanic folks, many of whom who are legal immigrants who came in the country legally and are not a fan of illegal immigration, right? So this myth that minorities are this stronghold of progressivism just is not true. And they've made a devil's bargain with the Democratic Party, and they vote for the Democratic Party, but have a lot of cultural, differences in terms of kind of cultural politics. And so if J.D. Vance and Trump are smart, they will weld cultural conservatism to economic populism. And I think that is a very politically dangerous and really hard to beat force, right? Now, whether that'll happen is there's a lot of racism baked into the Republican Party, et cetera. But I think the question for Democrats is like, how close to that politically savvy ideal are they going to get, right? Like, are they going to do whacked out abortion stuff that everyone hates? Or are they going to moderate a little bit while still being very culturally conservative, doing the economic stuff, and have a lot of popular support?
And just to underscore your point about communities of color, that's also true inside the Democratic Party. I mean, Bernie Sanders, one of the big challenges that he faced, and I can speak with firsthand authority on that, one of the big challenges he faced was because he was presented and portrayed as the left flank of the Democratic Party. I think that was part of the trouble he had at times with Black voters. It wasn't his specific economic policy agenda. It was like, I think there was a specific pockets of communities of color that were like, that see themselves as more conservative. We're like, I'm not going to vote for the lefty candidate in the primary.
Well, one thing I'd add to that, I'm really glad, Tyler, you brought up J.D. Vance's wife. So, I'm of Indian heritage. My parents both came from India, and I will say that the crassness, and that is, I honestly think objective, there's a crassness to Democratic politics about how race is used. And you both just highlighted something very important. The Indian community is an incredibly conservative community in comparison to the liberal part of America. India as a country is still kind of, they're still working through things like gay marriage. Trans rights, I think, is not even in the discourse in India. And Democrats have just superficially just like lumped it, again, with kind of a lazy messaging, similar to the existential threat, which is everything the Republicans do is racist. Therefore, if they come in, you will be completely in the doghouse. I talked to so many Indian Americans who are like, that makes zero sense to me because my coworker is a Trump supporter, or I live here and I've been able to. There's a lot of complexities, and I want to be very clear to anyone listening. I am not saying there is no racism in Republican politics, but I think it turns off a lot of communities of color when this crass kind of flattening of it happens right now. And what I have just really felt, thinking about the lack of economic populism, the way that they talk about race, is I just wonder if this generation of Democratic political operatives are kind of incompetent and they don't really, they don't know how to properly message a campaign. So they're going to go on, oh, it's an existential threat to democracy. Oh, people aren't really buying that. And the response isn't, hey, we should rejigger our message, or let's make the populist policies interesting. Let's sell this in a heroes versus villains kind of way. We're taking on Amazon, Ticketmaster, Google. This is the Biden administration. How many young people would be thrilled if you just made campaign slogans that said F Ticketmaster, for example?
100%.
You know, and they don't do that. And I think what really bothers me about the reactionary part of Democratic discourse is that they frame it as either people are stupid or the media is out to get them or everyone is racist. And I am just starting to come down to maybe you're just bad at this job. Maybe you don't know how to message what should be slam dunks on the court. And instead, you're throwing up your arms trying to say that the refs are, I mean, I'm a big basketball fan. It reminds me of like players doing badly on the court and then going, well, the refs didn't let me do this. And it's like, shut up, LeBron. Like, you were able to make that shot.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. The incompetence I find to be truly staggering. You know, I mean, just staggering.
I mean, and I also think that the Democrats are that the Democratic operative class is just used to a different playbook. I saw a quote from Josh Hawley, who's again part of this J.D. Vance Trump sort of realignment wing of the Republican Party, and I feel like in reading this quote, he just wrote it yesterday about it was about the Teamsters guy speaking at the Republican convention, and Hawley, you know, saw an opportunity, wrote an essay, and here was his quote, because I think this quote like succinctly puts together what they're trying to do. Quote, "The C-suite long ago sold out the United States, shuttering factories in the homeland and gutting American jobs, while using the profits to push diversity, equity, and inclusion and the religion of the trans flag." Now, I just want to marvel at that sentence, because the second half of the sentence is like factually, I think, wrong. Like
there's no logical relation to the first half of the sentence.
The business class did not outsource American jobs and then use the profits to set up DEI offices and raise a trans, like that literally did not happen. Right? Yeah. But like, you can see what they're trying to fuse together. And I think what they're trying to do, and I think what the Democratic operative class has opened itself up to, is we the Republicans are portraying the Democrats as caring only about some vanishingly small set of quote unquote wokesters and other very small demographic groups. They don't care about regular, I'm putting that in quotes too, regular folks, right? And they're willing to sit by as corporate America steamrolls over regular folks. And they're willing to stand by that and just advocate for a vanishingly small set of their own, demographic special interests. And I think the Democratic operative class for decades got used to just saying, well, the Republicans are racist. The Republicans are just racist, and like so they can say that to us, but like you the voter, you don't want to stand with the guy with the white hood, do you? And I just think like it's played out. It doesn't work. Like nobody buys that shit anymore.
Well, and the reason they don't buy it is because we had 4 years of Trump. I'm a black guy. I lived through 4 years of Trump. It was not substantively different than the previous 4 years under Obama in any way that relates to my racial identity. It was the same. Everything was fine. And I think a lot of minorities believed the Trump thing, and then they saw 4 years of it and are like, it was fine. Like the economy was fine. I didn't agree with some of the stuff. I didn't like the clown show, but I wasn't put in a camp. Like I don't believe that anymore. And I also think there's just, I think there's a certain, like, minorities are not dumb. They know that rich liberals don't send their kids to schools with black kids. They send them to rich private schools with not a minority in sight, And so I think they're like, you're just as racist as the hillbillies, So I don't think people believe it.
I think a lot of people forgive Trump for, like, Trump can make like vaguely racist comments, like what was the one that the Democrats tried, like black jobs or whatever, it's like it's like stupidly racist, right? Like I feel like lots of people of color just like hear that in their daily lives, and not that it's cool or anything, but it's like it's not that
Sure.
It's very Archie
it's
Bunker.
Like the guys, right? Exactly, Archie Bunker's right. It's like I think what would be more actionable and offensive is if like Trump is if he was like to actively put forward like wildly racist policies, like explicitly racist policies, and like I'm not saying like he didn't do lots of things that hurt communities of color disproportionately, but like he wasn't like he wasn't like Bull Connor. Right, like So I think you're right. I think it takes the efficacy away from the arguments being made against him. So we have to switch. We have to turn before we end this. We have to turn to the Democrats here for one last couple of minutes here. The fight to preserve Joe Biden as the nominee. I mean, this is. First of all, I just want to start this by saying, I think it's actually mind-boggling and incredibly actually encouraging that this foment is even happening. I mean, I've gotten so used to a top-down Democratic Party that's got everything locked down, like the whole internal discourse is so locked down that I'm frankly surprised that it's gotten this far, right? And I think the fact that like members of Congress are coming out and saying Joe Biden shouldn't be the nominee. I mean, what it says is two things. One, the party, there was a discontent that's been building up, and that's healthy and good. And two, the situation, the actual like physical situation with Joe Biden is truly so dire, and the polling situation is truly so dire that like rank and file Congress people are speaking up. Like that's a reflection of how bad the situation really is, because the typical rank and file Democratic congressperson is not often speaking up against their own president, certainly not saying they gotta go. But of course, the pushback has been, also pretty incredible. Like the pushback of like, we're actually not going to listen to senators and congresspeople, and we're just going to try to ram this through. I mean, what do you make of that? Like, what's the takeaway from, okay, like we've hit like sort of two incredible inflection points in the Democratic Party. Like legitimate members of Congress, party leaders are speaking out, and like the people who are still clinging to power are like, in some ways not cowed by it. So what do we make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally remarkable. I mean, well, I think all the, people cling to power. Biden is a megalomaniac, whose image was largely rehabilitated to run him as the good guy against Donald Trump when he, he was friends with people in the KKK and has a history of, kind of general dirtbaggery. So I think there's been a lot of Biden rehabilitation, and there's always been the two Bidens, the public decent man, and then, the other Biden behind the scenes. But I think we're getting the other Biden. The other Biden's in the saddle right now,
Such a good point.
And so I'm not surprised he's clinging to power. And I think the only way you should be surprised is if you believed that sort of 2020 election propaganda about Joe, but I am shocked that there hasn't been a more concerted effort. I mean, there's a lot of leaks coming from the Democratic side that, we know he can't win, blah, blah, blah. But it is totally stunning that, for example, the DNC, I think they're calling it off, but was trying to ram in a vote to get him nominated early. I mean, they're just spitting in the face of the public. If there's something that's I found encouraging is that there is a cross-ideological coalition of people that have been absolutely melting down over this and are saying we can see Biden with our own two eyes. He doesn't make any sense. He seems to be losing a grip on reality. He can barely read a teleprompter. He has to go, right? And we don't believe that the polls are fake. We don't believe any of the spin that you're giving us. And that's really been across the ideological spectrum. And I found that really heartening. I think there is a core group of Democrats who live in reality and are not going to swallow hook, line, and sinker a bunch of lies. And they've also been told for 8 years or whatever that the Democrats are the party of truth and honesty and democracy dies in darkness and blah, blah, blah. And I think to many folks' credit, they believed that. And they're like, no. You were, when Trump denied the polls, you you lampooned him for being, an anti-intellectual and a liar and blah, blah, blah. And now you guys are doing that. And so I have found that heartening, that pushback does not seem to break down along, centrist, moderate versus left. It's across the board. And the flip side, of course, is the Keep Biden coalition is also sort of cross-ideological. You have people like AOC, joining forces with some pro-Biden moderates.
So I want to throw into
stunning.
This discussion then an argument that I've seen put out there, which is that, and Biden has tried to sort of glom onto this argument that, okay, look, there are parts of the donor class whose motives are not great, right? Parts of the donor class that don't like the populist policies that Joe Biden has actually passed that he, of course, never talks about. That's a separate issue. He never talks about it. The Democrats don't want to brand to it. But like Lena Khan at the FTC, the activism of Rohit Chopra at the CFPB, like the donor class that doesn't like that, participating in trying to push Biden out is somehow a signal that the push to get Biden out is wrong or bad or not anything that somebody progressive should want to be involved in, because it's really a way to get rid of the good policies of the Biden administration. And I think that AOC and Bernie Sanders have tried to glom onto that as well. Oh, Joe Biden is putting forward a great agenda, and the next person who would be in there wouldn't reappoint Lena Khan to the FTC. The policies wouldn't be as good, and that's the donor class's involvement. Before I hear what you have to say, my take on this is that I see this more in terms of popular front. A sort of popular front paradigm, that if lots of rank and file Bernie Sanders supporters are willing to stand together with Bill Kristol and the Never Trump Republicans who are willing to stand together with the Pod Save America guys, and we have a poll out there now that right as we're talking just came out, 2/3 of rank and file Democratic voters say they want a different nominee, right? That what it means is that lots of people may be coming to this for different motives, but that's okay. Like that's okay. But I do take seriously the argument that, I guess what do you make of the AOC, Bernie Sanders, now Biden saying, I'm not going to be pushed out by the elites, and this is like an elite coup. I mean, right. That's what it's been called. Like, this is like a coup of the donor class. What do you make of that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know. I find it baffling. I mean, I think there's potentially a little bit of political nihilism that AOC and company they do not believe Democrats are going to do the right thing. And so they're just like, we just got to ride with Biden and stick this out and try to win. I think that's like the charitable explanation. I do think, that argument, though, this is an elite push. I think we need to be smart about thinking about like, what are the different motives of these stakeholders that are coming together to try to push Biden out, right? I think we should be smart about that. I don't think we need to be, kumbaya or have this Panglossian understanding of everyone's different motives. But at the same time, if the king is in a clown suit and a bunch of different kinds of people are saying, hey, the king is in a clown suit, does it really matter that some of those people are peasants and then other people are like, we're in the king's entourage? Like, yes, is one possible explanation that, the people in the king's entourage saying the king is in a clown suit has ulterior motives? Absolutely. Is it all possible that we just all exist in shared reality and can see that the king is in a clown suit? And that includes 85% of the American public and then also some very rich people. I mean, that's the explanation I go to. And that doesn't mean, to your point, we need to paper over that the donors would probably love to see someone other than Lena Khan in there. But it does mean that, there are multiple explanations for why this is happening. And I think the donors are on the side of, or are in the same camp as huge swaths of the electorate, and this is just a way to try to make this seem like a coup from a group of rich people.
I also think, one last point, I also think it's not either or, right? I don't think this idea that it like the donors are trying to get rid of Joe Biden and effectively they're trying to get rid of his agenda. That's why they're participating in this. And that the next Democrat will be like some, old school Clinton era corporate hack Democrat, right? I mean, maybe that happens, but like, it doesn't have to happen, right? I've always taken the view of Joe Biden, like some folks have gotten mad at me, though. How could you say that Joe Biden has such the best economic policies of the last 50 years? He's been his record has been bad. He was a centrist Democrat. I've always taken the position that, listen, the reason Joe Biden has good policies is because Joe Biden only actually has one skill. And his skill is knowing where the center of the Democratic Party is. And over many years, the center of the Democratic Party shifted, and thus and so he had to adopt the policies that he adopted. And I think presumably anybody who would replace him also knows where the center of the Democratic Party is and will not want to juxtapose themselves against that center if they replace him. Thus and so is more likely to simply adopt the basic policy program of the Biden administration. I don't imagine,
which is popular. It's a popular.
Exactly.
Popular.
Like, I don't
People
think we're in a
like
situation where like the donors get somehow it's like we get President Joe Manchin. I mean, I guess maybe we might. Right. But like, I think like, okay, like, I guess there's a chance of that, but I think it's more likely it'll just be some generic Democrat, which is exactly what Joe Biden is. Joe Biden is a generic Democrat. He just happens to be 9,000 years old and in cognitive decline.
The other thing is, if you're a donor and you hate Biden's policies and you want to put an end to them, why would you do any of this? Just let the guy run. He's so clearly on a bad footing. All you have to do is
get out of the way.
Kick back with kick back with some lemonade, play Animal Crossing, and he'll do it to himself. So I don't really understand the argument that they want to tank him because he's doing that very easily himself.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I would point out is I know some people in the sort of donor class of Democrats, and what I hear from them overwhelmingly is like a meltdown about losing. Like, we're losing. We're going to lose. We can't lose. We're losing. And I think, as somebody on the sort of Marxist-y end of the left, I'm not I'm not on team donor here, but I think there is like, people are forgetting that these are also people that can donate to the Republican Party, but choose to donate to the Democratic Party.
Right.
And on top of that, don't want to lose. And I think, the message I hear is like, we're losing. Why are we not even trying to win? Right. And I think, do I have lots of policy disagreements with those folks? I'm sure. But do I think they're motivated by like wanting to actually try to win the election? Yes.
Well, Tyler, thanks so much for joining us today. This is an awesome round robin.
It's been fun. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with help from Chris Walker and editing support from Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with more episodes of Lever Time.